Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Laowa 8-15mm f2.8 fisheye zoom. And even if you're not in the market for this kind of lens, keep watching as it's pretty unique. Announced in early 2025, it's designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras, and it's available in Sony E, Leica L, Nikon Z and Canon RF mounts, the latter possible since it's a manual focus lens with no electronic communications. It costs around $700, but check the links in the description for the latest and UK pricing. Fisheye lenses are unashamedly specialist, squeezing a 180-degree field of view into your image with pronounced barrel distortion. Rather than trying to maintain straight lines like a rectilinear ultra-wide angle, a fisheye embraces the curves, dramatically bending any lines that don't pass directly through the middle of the frame into bananas. They actually have a surprisingly wide range of applications though, most obviously recording the entire sky, whether day or night, and also great for time lapses of weather patterns or Milky Way views, but also popular for underwater photography or embracing the distortion for extreme sports at really close range or even creative vlogging. Do be careful with that huge field of view though, as angling the camera down by even a small amount will capture a view of your feet. Amazingly, there are actually very few fisheye lenses in the native mirrorless mounts, especially for full-frame bodies, and even counting older DSLR mounts, there's only been 2 fisheye zooms that at least I can recall. First was Canon's EF 8-15mm f4.8 USM, which I reviewed on my Camera Labs website back in 2011, and it still sells for around $1,250 new. It's a stop dimmer than the Laowa, but sports autofocus, and as an L lens it also has weather sealing, and with an EF mount it's also easy to adapt to pretty much any mirrorless system. Meanwhile, Nikon made their own version in 2017, the AFS 8-15mm 3.5 to 4.5 EED, also priced at around $1,250, which Thomas reviewed on my Camera Labs website if you're interested. This model's still dimmer than the Laowa though, indeed with a variable aperture, but again offers autofocus and can be adapted to mirrorless bodies quite easily. So 14 years after the Canon and 7 years after the Nikon, Laowa's 8-15mm is an interesting proposition. Not only is it natively mirrorless, but brighter than those 2 earlier DSLR options. And best of all, while the Canon and Nikon 8-15s cost over $1,000 new, if you can even find them for sale, Laowa's is a relative bargain. The obvious downside to the Laowa lens is its manual focus only, and also lacks any communications with the body. So while most cameras can still meter the light that's passing through its aperture diaphragm, in turn allowing you to shoot in manual or aperture priority, your files won't be recording the actual f-number, the focal length or the distance, and fully auto exposure modes won't be possible. It's just like using a vintage mechanical lens. So with the scene set, let's see what it can do. I tested the E-mount version on a Sony a7R II using aperture priority for a semi-automatic experience and magnified focusing assistance to nail the manual focusing. First for coverage, when set to 8mm on a full-frame body, this exotic lens delivers a full circular fisheye image with a 180-degree field of view in every direction. Notice the dark area outside of the imaging circle. This is intentional. As you zoom the lens to longer focal lengths, the imaging circle gradually becomes cropped by the sensor until the image fills the frame with a rectangular image at around 14mm. Now this is still delivering the same 180-degree field of view as before, but now only across the diagonal. Then for the remainder of the zoom range to 15mm, the field crops a little bit to around 175 degrees on the diagonal. So while it's not a traditional zoom, the 8-15 does effectively give you 2 fisheye lenses in one, a circular fisheye and a diagonal full-frame fisheye, with the latter giving you a little extra adjustment to the crop. Measuring 76mm in diameter, 95mm long and weighing 650 grams, it's roughly similar in diameter to the Canon and Nikon versions, but a bit longer and heavier due in part to its brighter aperture. It's not weather sealed, but it feels like a solid piece of kit with a reassuring heft to it. Starting closest to the mount is the aperture ring, running between f2.8 and 22 in single stop clicked increments, again like a vintage lens. Next comes a narrow zoom ring with focal lengths marked from 8 to 15mm in 1mm increments. Note how the bulbous front element shifts back and forth a little while you zoom. And finally, at the end of the barrel is a more generous manual focusing ring with distances marked in feet and meters down to the minimum distance of 16cm or 0.6 feet. The focus throw is about 70 degrees and it's possible to make very fine adjustments, which as you'll discover is actually more necessary than you might assume for such a wide-angle lens. There's also hard stops at each end of the focusing range, and in my tests I could dial in infinity with the lens at 8mm by simply twisting the ring to the very end, so that's very handy if you're into astrophotography. But at the 15mm focal length I found infinity was positioned just a fraction back from the hard stop. Now this could have been my own copy of the lens, but either way I'd always recommend confirming focus with magnified assistance when using larger apertures to make sure, or if you're in a rush just stop down a little bit. Here's a demonstration showing magnified focusing assistance with focus peaking, where you can see how you will need to make adjustments when focusing on closer subjects, especially when the aperture is wide open. In fact, at f2.8 and approaching the closest focusing distance of 16cm, you can actually achieve some blurring in the background, and this allows the lens to deliver quite a unique look coupled with that 180 degree coverage. But be careful, as at the minimum focusing distance the subject will be close to that big front element. Speaking of protection, there's unsurprisingly no filter thread on the front, nor is there provision for rear-mounted filters at the back. Laowa does supply a metal cap though that's pushed over the end of the barrel and held in friction, as is normal for this type of lens. Okay, now for my quality tests starting at 8mm 2.8, and these are all raw files processed with a fixed white balance and slightly boosted sharpening. I didn't enable CA correction, and in the absence of any lens profiles or communications, you're looking at the pure optical quality of this lens. Note that I've angled the view for consistency with my other lens tests, but for a circular fisheye image, it's actually not necessary. The point of angling the view is to ensure that details run up to the edge of the imaging circle, and since we can see all of the circle, this view could really be any orientation. But again, I'm going to keep it diagonal for consistency. So taking a close look in the middle shows an excellent level of crisp details with the aperture wide open to 2.8, although stopping down will see mild boosts in contrast, plus of course giving you a more forgiving depth of field. Returning to the 2.8 sample and moving into the corner shows a mild reduction in crispness, but it's not bad at all. Closing the aperture sees mild improvements, peaking I'd say between f5.6 and f8, but beware of closing the aperture any further as diffraction can kick in. Now for the lens of the 15mm focal length, where we do need to have the view angled to see it approaching the edge of the imaging circle. First here at 2.8 of course, and taking a close look in the middle you'll again see a decent degree of detail, even when that aperture is wide open. Closing the aperture can see very mild improvements to the crispness in the middle, but I'd say that lens is already looking pretty good here, at least in the middle of the frame. So now let's return to the 2.8 image and head into the far corner. Now this time there's more noticeable softening of the image in the extremes. As I gradually stop down the aperture this does improve, but it's not until around f11 that the details are looking at their best, and at this point onwards diffraction will kick in and is going to soften your overall image. So if you're after the maximum sharpness across the frame while avoiding the effects of diffraction, I'd say the best balance is going to be around f8, give or take a stop. But if you're only bothered about detail towards the middle of the frame, I'd say you could shoot this lens at its larger apertures without too much compromise. Of course, sometimes diffraction is exactly what you want, so here's how the lens looks at 8mm f2.8 when pointed directly at the sun, where you'll see some reasonably sharp spikes, albeit at different lengths here. More obviously though, check out that circular flare, which I actually quite like here. Next, for the same subject at 15mm for a full frame diagonal image, again at f2.2, and again showing that circular flare effect. Now this is actually only visible when you're pointing directly at the light source, as angling the lens even slightly away will see it essentially disappear. And as noted at the start, if the horizon or any other line passes through the centre of the image, it'll also be spared from barrel distortion. Here's a quick video clip showing the flare effect as I move the sun around the frame, and again note the shape of the horizon as it moves away from the centre. Please do forgive any marks on this video though, as both the lens and your sensor need to be meticulously clean when pointing with this kind of scene, especially when the aperture is close to f2.2. At the other end of the aperture scale, it's actually possible to enjoy more background blur than you might expect with this kind of lens, at least when you're close to the minimum focusing distance. So here's my bokeh ball test with the ornament almost as close as the lens would focus, and with the aperture wide open to 2.8 where you can see the lights rendered as small blobs. And now for the same view with the lens zoomed to 15mm 2.8, where again there may be greater blurring in the background than you'd assume. I've got more examples to show you in just a moment. The dramatic view of fisheye lenses certainly makes for some unique looking video, even if you're only zooming back and forth from a fixed position. I mentioned vlogging as an application at the start, and here's how it looks when filming at arm's length, handheld, which also gives you an idea about portrait shot from this distance. If you stick towards the middle of the frame, you'll also avoid the distortion, but move away and things are going to look pretty weird pretty quickly. Now there can also be more wobbles than you might expect, as IBIS doesn't always work well with fisheye lenses, and close subjects are magnified so they're going to accentuate any movement. So all these clips were filmed without stabilisation, and if it's an effect that you'd like to explore further, I'd say that a gimbal is the way forward. And finally, for an astro shot taken from a fairly urban environment, so it's a bit bright, but giving you an idea of the kind of effect that's possible. This is a 10-second exposure at 1600 ISO, with the aperture wide open to 2.8 and the focal length at 8mm for a circular fisheye view. And taking a close look in the middle, that's the constellation of Leo, you'll see some fairly well defined star points. Meanwhile, heading towards the edge of the imaging circle on the right, you'll spot Orion, and at this point some of the star images are exhibiting a bit of coma, but it's actually not too bad, and I also noticed that stopping down to f4 could improve this a little bit. Again, I found that infinity focus at 8mm was achieved at the hard stop of the focusing ring, making setup for astro nice and easy. And now it's time for my verdict with a bunch of sample images, typically shown in pairs at both 8mm and 15mm from the same position. As for the aperture values, I've got no idea as they weren't recorded in the files, but if you're seeing a close subject with a slightly blurred background, then they'll probably be at f2.8. The Laowa 8-15mm 2.8 fisheye zoom is a pretty unique lens, one of the only fisheyes designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras, not to mention offering a zoom and a bright f2.8 aperture. It'll deliver the classic 180-degree field of view in both circular and full-frame diagonal formats, while the bright aperture will actually allow some background blur when used near to the closest focusing distance. It's a purely mechanical lens with manual focusing and no communications with the body, just like a vintage lens. But since the aperture ring directly adjusts the diaphragm, most cameras will still be able to meter the incoming light and let you use it in aperture priority mode for a semi-automatic experience, or of course in full manual if you prefer. Plus, by avoiding autofocus, Laowa can make a version for Canon RF, as well as Nikon Z, to join the less restrictive Sony E and L mounts. The optical quality is very good when wide open at 2.8, with sharp details near and far across most of the frame. For the sharpest results at the edge of the imaging circle, it does benefit from being closed a few stops though, especially at 15mm. Now it is an unashamedly specialist lens, but it's also a relative bargain compared to those which preceded it. You may find Canon and Nikon's 8-15mm lenses still for sale somewhere, and both sport autofocus too, but they're optically dimmer than the Laowa and considerably more expensive at around $1,250 new. Since these are the kind of lenses that generally pre-focus, I don't actually think that a lack of autofocus is that big an issue, so I find the Laowa 8-15 an easy lens to recommend if you're into fisheye photography or videography. And that's it for this review, amazingly my first of a Laowa lens, so do let me know not only what you think of it, but whether you'd like to see me review more of these other brands. As always, thanks for watching, please do consider giving my channel a follow if you enjoy my reviews, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.